So this episode is an interview with Colin Wright, who is a man of many fames. I started perusing his blog, Exile Lifestyle, many years ago while I was doing a bunch of traveling, and was very inspired by the sort of lifestyle this man was living. And basically what he would do is he would go for 4 months at a time to a place intentionally to do something between living and traveling. Obviously, if you stay in a place for several months, you can sort of get a great feel and introduction to the place without sort of laying too many roots. Colin himself is a very prolific writer. He's written dozens of books and keeps a very active blog and runs a very cool podcast called Let's Know Things, which is in addition to his writing, just a sort of nice tight accumulation of some knowledge. In this chat, we spoke about highlights from his travels, from Calcutta to the Philippines to the United States. We spoke about the upsides and the downsides of the digital nomadic movement. We spoke about minimalism, something for which he's quite well known for on the internet. And then finally, at the end of the discussion, we kind of started touching on a little bit of geopolitics as well, which I think might just be a consequence of someone who has such a passion and interest in the wider world and in understanding how different locations and countries work. I really identified with him on that level when we got to speaking about those topics. So look, there's no ads or anything from me. The one thing I can just ask from you, please, is to subscribe to this podcast, because although this episode might not be for you or the next one might not be for you, the hope is that as the episodes come in, you at least have a chance to peruse them and say, perhaps this is actually something worth looking at. So if you could just swipe up your phone, subscribe to the podcast, that is really the best thing you can do for me. And I just want to quickly plug as well my the Inserto and Nassim Taleb podcast as well, which if you are interested in the ideas of the Inserto or of the ideas of Nassim Taleb, great crash course over there. And then also the Geopolitics and Power podcast, which is a new podcast I released recently, which is going to look at things from massive infrastructure projects to natural resources to what the future of the Arctic looks like. Who knows? Basically, that's going to be periodically releasing episodes as well. And then finally, I'm writing loads of stuff online, so you'll find all the relevant links in the description. Just go in there, subscribe to the newsletter, subscribe to the podcast. Just do your best to support this little content creator. So thank you very much. And you're a bloody legend for listening, so thank you as well. Now here is a really fascinating chat with Colin Wright. Thank you so much for taking the time. I've just introduced you, so there's no need for that. But maybe if you wanted to give us a quick short bio, that would be amazing.
Short bio is always the tricky part. Someday I'll get good enough that I can explain myself in like fortune cookie format. But right now I write books. I've got a couple of podcasts, Let's Know Things and Brain Lenses. I've got a couple of newsletters, some that I curate, some that are like essay format. I travel around usually quite a bit. When we're not in pandemic times, I travel substantially more than I do currently. And typically I travel quite light. I've lived a fairly minimalistic lifestyle for the past, decade plus, since 2009. And back in the day, ran a branding studio, have kind of been fairly entrepreneurial my entire life. But since then, since I left LA back in 2009 and started traveling, I've traveled via different templates full time and have mostly lived out of just carry-on luggage.
Brilliant. Great shooting place to start off from, because I want to start with the travel question, okay? So yeah, look, you've been a business owner to then you sold everything to then you traveled, seemingly everywhere, and then you write loads as well. That's definitely something we're going to get into. I heard you say in one of your speeches that you'd published dozens of books. So I counted 19 from the website. So we'll see about that. But nonetheless, I wanted to start by asking you this, and I'm taking this from your website. I've lived in Argentina, New Zealand, Thailand, Iceland, India, Romania, the Czech Republic, the Philippines, and visited about 60 other countries and all 48 contiguous US states twice. Road trip South America, wandered Southeast Asia, explored Europe by train, and enjoyed many other travel-related adventures. So it's very unfair for me to just ask you what your favorite trip or favorite destination has been. But I wonder if perhaps you could tell me if an adventure stands out for having changed you the most.
Changed me the most. I mean, all of them, I could make that argument probably for any of them. I think most travelers would probably be able to say that. Very seldom do you go someplace and change your context, even just a little bit, much less dramatically, and not walk away with something new and some new point of view that three-dimensionalizes the world for you in some new way. Um, Living in Calcutta in India was very different, especially at the time. I hadn't been to, first of all, like a mega city of that
Hmm.
kind before. I hadn't lived in a place where the poverty levels were so high before. And just the circumstances of the trip were as such that I had the opportunity to meet just a very large number of remarkable people, just remarkable, not in the sense of, people who are being interviewed on podcasts because,
Uh-huh.
they write books or do something that looks good on a business card, but remarkable just because of their humanity and
Yeah.
because of the kindness that they're willing to show to a stranger who knew less than nothing about what I was stepping into. And that experience, there's some more storied and interesting narrative parts than others. I was in a Bollywood commercial and
Oh
was
yeah.
ended up on a billboard at one point, strangely. But like really, it was just the day-to-day stuff that was
Hmm.
interesting, and just living there and the mechanics of living there,
Yeah.
and the reality that people live in, and so many wonderful things, so many incredibly flawed things, like every place that you might go.
Yeah.
But for me, those wonderful things and flawed things were very different from the wonderful and flawed things that I was accustomed to.
Perhaps you could expand on it a little bit for us and maybe just give like context. What was the trip? How long were you there? And what are you doing during the days? Because what is so meeting the people obviously makes a massive change. But if I'm just sort of speaking from experience, the sort of changes that you have are always contextualized within where you are in your life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, a lot of my time at the time was just writing. And so it was writing for my blog, Exile Lifestyle. At the time, I had a project, and this was unfortunately, and this happens an unfortunate amount of the time actually. I had a project called Exiles, which was like a membership program before the infrastructure existed for membership programs.
Okay.
And so I had people who paid each month or each year, and they would get like my books that I published for free, plus additional
Oh,
email
nice.
newsletters, which
Like
again had
pre-Patreon or
technology.
something.
Yeah, it unfortunately, I thought about this later once I actually had
Uh-huh.
the tools that were pre-built for me for this, and it would have worked so much better. But I was working on that and that type of additional member content, and books, basically, just
Okay,
sitting
nice.
around and writing. And then when I wasn't doing that, I was meeting up with people who, I would meet one person and say, who else should I meet? And then go meet three other people, and then meet three other
Oh,
people
right
from
on.
those.
Okay.
And usually just asking for introductions to anybody, like who do you like? Who do you hang out with? And
Yeah.
then where do you go? And then going to that part of town and wandering around, and where do you eat lunch and trying to go there. And
Uh-huh.
the idea is, as much as possible, to try to see what people's day-to-day life is like in different places. And so people always want to take you to the impressive place, or they
Hmm.
always want to take you to the fancy place, or
Hmm.
the place that the visitors to the country like.
Yeah.
And some of those places, they have a lot going for them.
Uh-huh.
But for me, I typically get the most out of trying to imagine, here's what it's like. I go to work. I had a friend who worked at Tata Steel. Tata, they own everything
Yeah.
there, and so she works at this company, this big kind of faceless company, and she works in social media, and that's how we initially connected. And it's like, here's what her life is like, and here's some of the people that she hangs out with who influence her worldview. Here's the beliefs. I got to meet her family, who are just absolutely wonderful.
Hmm.
Um, just so many interesting connections, and so many things that have the potential, if you approach it in the wrong way, to be very boring. Because to somebody, these things are boring. These are the things that they do every single day.
Hmm.
But something that's consistent to me is that someone else's boring is someone's remarkable and
Hmm.
different and strange and unlikely. And uh, for me, that tends to be where I get the most inspiration and
Yeah.
fulfillment from travel.
It might be true that if someone would find that sort of experience boring, they would just never find themselves in that situation. Like this is something they're very actively sought out, and therefore, you find it so fascinating because you're seeking out these unique experiences, which really is kind of the fruits of any sort of adventure that you can go on. You want that unique experience, and so I suppose maybe that's why you find it so fascinating. But what year was it, and then how long were you there? Because I'm trying to create a bit of a context for what this
What
trip looks
year?
like.
That probably would have been 2011 or 2012, I think. And I was there for about 5 months. Typically, I try to do 4 months
Hmm.
because I found that's the right amount of time that you can put down some roots and build
Hmm.
some actual like real relationships, but it's not so
Hmm.
long that you're building a life in a
Yep.
place, which there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're trying to see multiple places, I had never left the country before I started traveling full time, and so I was trying to build out my context of the world.
Hmm.
And so I wanted places so that I could compare and contrast and
Yep.
see these many different angles as opposed to just a couple. Um, so 4 months was my ideal. A lot of places you can only do 3 because of travel restrictions,
Yep.
legally at least,
Yep.
and usually you want to abide by that, with few exceptions. In India, in Calcutta, though, I found out the bureaucracy there is just so astonishingly complex, and
Really.
it's so they call it the land of paperwork. And
Yeah.
the explanation that I got for why this was the case is that basically when the British were running things, they had bureaucrats running bureaucrats, just this insanely complex system to collect paperwork and keep tabs on information and
Hmm.
trades and everything like that. And then basically the folks who run it today continue with a lot of those gestures and movements, but then they don't do anything with the data. And as a consequence, they jump through all these hoops and force everybody else to do the same, but
Yeah.
then they lose the paperwork, or it's not filed correctly, or there's not standards that are adhered to as well as they need to be for that amount of data.
Hmm.
And so I tried to get a cell phone 3 times. They kept on losing the paperwork. Each time I had to have it signed by like 5 people. When I tried to rent a flat, it took me a whole month just to go to dozens of different police stations and get signatures from everybody. And I was only able to do it as fast as I did because the guy who was renting me the flat had kind of a local fixer that he worked with, and he took me around on his motorbike, and we
Man,
drove.
so absurd, eh?
it
Yeah.
it was nuts. I mean, it was, of course, it was an interesting experience
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
That was very educational, but in the moment, it was miserable. And I felt
Uh-huh.
like I couldn't get anything done. And I felt like nobody around me could see how stupid this was, because this was just normal for
Mm,
folks who grew up there.
exactly.
Um, and the US is not the most efficient place in the world, but compared to that,
Yeah.
we're like clockwork here. We're the trains are all running on time and everything's perfect and
Hmm.
precise. So that was very interesting. But it also is the reason that I stayed for 5 months, because that first month I didn't feel like I was there yet. I was just
Really.
wading through this sea of paperwork.
Going through that experience though, it does serve your broader appreciation of the world, and probably makes you respect these people that then take you in and are hospitable, who don't have that much, even more, because you know sort of what the struggle that they're going through, and you've met this same person in your own country where there is no bureaucracy and things are great. I mean, they call Australia the lucky country, and you're like, I've never seen someone like you before who would do this. So you've said that this trip, Calcutta, was particularly memorable to you. You know, maybe one of the adventures that changed you the most, and it was through the amazing experiences you had with the local people. But this is in the context of you've done this in many other cities around the world. Have you been to other, developing economies and developing cities and been in that same situation? Because I want to find out, like, what was it about Calcutta specifically that made you remember
Mm.
something? You know, were you in a particular part of your life, or did you meet a particular person that then went to change you on? Did you have some sort of epiphany about the writing you were doing? You know, what was there a specific thing?
It's probably all of those things. Because I have been in other places where it's been, I mean, every place is different, obviously, and every group of people that you're fortunate to meet in these places are different. The circumstances are different, the history and the culture of the place are different. In India, it was still relatively early on. It was just a couple of years that I'd been on the road, and the places that I'd been up till that point, I think, let's see, I'd lived in Argentina and New Zealand and Thailand and Iceland, maybe Romania. No, it was India before Romania, I think. But in any case, the places that I had to compare it to at that point, it was so radically distinct that every single thing about that experience, every single day, there was just this collection of truly, to me, original sensory experiences, and that means everything from the food and the language, because there's so many languages spoken in the area, to learning about the history just through talking to people, and then going home and it's like, okay, I learned this and this and this, let's look this up and find out more, and then going home and working, and the experience of trying to work too, because that's something that you have that you have a baseline for it. I know what working is like. I know what it's like to sit down and write. What's that like in all these different environments? Well, there at the time, just getting on the internet was an incredibly difficult thing for me because of where I was living, because of the infrastructure available to me. I'm sure the context at the time was different. My understanding, a lot of the places that I lived back then that had terrible internet, like New Zealand at the
Yeah,
time
yeah,
when
not
I
good,
lived
eh?
there, had like the worst internet I'd ever encountered.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
gotten much better because they've laid more cable since then.
Uh,
I'm sure it's the same in Calcutta at this point. So much has changed since I've been
mhm.
there. But all of those things aggregate into this unique experience. And you tend to tuck that away then as this cohesive thing, you know, that's it's marked in your head, almost like the like on your phone or something like that. It's got the collection, the gallery of photos that you have from a particular place. Here was your
Yeah.
experience in Calcutta. And I feel like all of these things have like mental meta tags of this distinct place, despite the fact that there are crossovers between these different things, and despite the fact that a lot of them are kind of locked in a particular moment in time as
Mhm.
well. So my experience in Kolkata will not be your experience in Kolkata, not
No,
just
yeah.
because of the chronological difference in visiting, but because we're going to go to different places, meet with different people, eat different food. So
Mhm. And so you're making money through writing exclusively, or were you still living off the coattails of your agency that you had gotten rid of back in LA?
at the time, it was exclusively the writing,
Okay,
and
that's
it
really
was
cool. Can you tell
yeah,
us about that? Because 2011, 2012, I mean, it's very early days for blogging, right? Where's your income coming from?
man. So like I said, I find myself in a lot of situations where I'm like a year or two ahead of having the correct way of doing things, like an easier, simpler tool.
Uh-huh.
I got into writing books basically maybe a year or two after the Kindle came out.
Hmm.
Maybe a couple of years after like the second generation Kindle. So like ebooks were still this shiny new thing, and you could put together an ebook and sell it as a PDF for X amount of dollars, or you could sell it for dramatically less than that and put it on Amazon, but then benefit from all the organic searching that was happening. And there were still so few ebooks that you actually stood a pretty decent chance of standing out if you wrote
Okay.
something somewhat unique or something valuable. And so I benefited a bit from that, of it being this new thing. And I had to invest some time in figuring out how to actually make an ebook and upload it using the antiquated or the very simple tools that were available at the time.
Right.
But that helped quite a bit. And then trying out the membership program thing helped quite a bit. But mostly what it was is that I had this blog that I'd written for a couple of years at that time, writing about this very unusual lifestyle choice.
Hmm.
And that allowed me then a lot of opportunities. And that included being able to say, hey, I wrote a book, and then stand a decent chance of having people buy it, whether or not it's
Hmm.
any good, which is very fortunate because most of our early work is not great according to most honest standards. But it also then gives you other opportunities to collaborate with other people. And I think back in the day, I did some workshops with people. I had some freelance writing that I was able to do
Okay.
with some travel sites, that kind of thing. Speaking eventually was added into the mix as well, though in the early days, that was also quite rough.
Yeah. No, I saw that. That's actually one of the first things that you sort of speak about on your site is the fact that you are a speaker, and this is almost kind of like your line of work, even though I suppose you introduce yourself as an author, though I'm not sure, maybe it's something different.
Honestly, I've been fortunate to not have to introduce myself for like a year while
Yeah.
I've been sitting at home during the pandemic. So I'll figure something else out because the workload does shift over
Yeah.
time. And I find author is an easy one in some cases because when you're traveling through like passport control, they pity you because they assume that just means you're unemployed. And so then you get through and they're like, oh, that poor guy, he's not going to cause any trouble. And then in some cases, it just is like, oh, Pete, he wrote a book. Cool. That tells
Uh-huh.
me a few things about this person. He
Well,
probably is somewhat of an introvert,
uh-huh.
among other things.
Oh, I don't know. I think the first thing people think is that it's quite exciting, to be honest. I mean, maybe that's just my personal projection. If I ever meet someone who's written a book, I'm like, oh, that's fucking impressive. I wonder how you got around to doing that around everything else that's probably happening in your life. But look, I mean, this is so if by 2011, 12, you're in Calcutta and this is, your fourth month leg, you've been doing this for a long time. It's very early in the so-called like digital nomad trend. As someone who's done it for so long, do you have much of an insight into whether this type of lifestyle has actually been one that people have done for as long as traveling's existed, or has the advent of the internet really accelerated just the our awareness of digital nomads?
The second one, I think it's the
Okay.
latter case. People have been doing this for ages. It's just that one, we're now able to do it more easily. I don't know if I would have the stamina, the durability to do it back in the day when people
Mm,
could only communicate via postcards and
mhm,
had to hop on steamships, or even before that, hopping on sail-powered
mhm.
ships. It would have been much more difficult. But also part of it is that just by definition, as we expand our communication tools, we also hear about more types of lifestyle and
Yep.
more people doing more things because those people can suddenly shout out into the void and you have a decent chance of hearing them.
Mhm,
So, I mean, I basically, part of the reason I was able to get in where I did and write about this and get some attention right away is not because I was the first, not because I did it the best, not because I was the best writer or anything else. It was because I had the fortuitous opportunity to stumble upon this concept and to do it at a time in which blogging had matured several years into its life. And so already people were starting to read that. Social media was just becoming a thing. And so suddenly, your megaphone got bigger and bigger and bigger.
mhm.
And I benefited from having portable devices. The iPhone was still relatively new. Smartphones as a whole were still relatively new at that time. Internet was still very hard to find in a lot of places, but
Mhm.
I always, when I wanted to, had a phone, and
Yeah.
so that made my starting point a very fortuitous point in which to start these things. And
Mhm.
I think that more than anything else is why we're hearing more about this type of lifestyle. And then
Yeah.
that has kind of I mean, pardon the comparison, kind of a pandemic effect where one person says it and talks about it. And usually we focus on the good things of those things, at least at first, the good things about these types of lifestyles. And
Mm.
then people take that and say, oh, that sounds great. I want to do
Yeah.
that too.
Yeah.
And then they start talking about it and it spreads and spreads and spreads.
It is such a seductive idea to live this sort of lifestyle. And I do want to ask you about what the downsides are, because the upsides are obvious. You don't even need to mention them. But before you speak about the downsides of the type of lifestyle, I guess I think Tim Ferriss's 4 Hour Work Week was 2009, just going off memory. I'm not sure. Maybe you have an insight into that or not. But it sounds like what you're saying is, rather than this book being a catalyst for a bunch of people to become digital nomads, it is really just the case that it's the internet has allowed us to hear about all the other digital nomads around, and yourself, writing a blog at the optimal time. And I'm thinking nomadic
By
on that.
luck, not design.
Yeah, I mean, but that's how the world works, eh? Like, there's a great Nassim Taleb quote that mild success is attributable to hard work and skills. Wild success is attributable to luck. So you work really hard, you'll get to the top 10% of your cohort, right? 100%. So you're working really hard. So you're at the top 10% of the cohort. You've got the ambition, you're writing a lot, you're thinking about other alternative lifestyles. Like, this is that's your competency that gets you to there. But then the luck comes along and it's like, rather than you going down the route of, who knows, you became an actor in Hollywood or something, you became a blogger. And it was the perfect time to be a blogger. And therefore, the rest is history. But can you tell us about the downsides to this type of lifestyle, digital nomadic lifestyle?
Yeah, well, it depends on how you do it because there really are as many different ways to have a somewhat nomadic lifestyle as there are people. I know people who stay in one place for 6 months out of the year, travel the other six, or 60-40%, something like that. I know other people who live out of a bag, other people who travel with like a duplex's worth of stuff and somehow don't get frustrated about carrying that on all these planes and trains and so on. Um, for me, the way that I did it, though, one of the major downsides is that it is trickier to build some types of relationships, just friendships and business relationships, romantic relationships. You have to be very intentional and almost focused on it because if you don't, a lot of the things that cause us to just casually, thoughtlessly slide into relationships are not there. You do
Mm,
not see the same person every day, typically, at least not for more than a few months at a time. And it takes a lot more intention and effort to maintain but also develop those relationships over time using the astonishingly cool and whiz bang tools that we have available. It's great that we have these, but it's not the same. as, oh, I happen to see this person every day at a physical office space or at a
Mhm.
coffee shop or
Mhm.
sitting at school. It's a different experience. So that's a big one. The inconsistency of accounting issues in terms of expenses, in terms of income. Most people who I know, not everybody, but most people who I know have some variability in either their expenses or income or both when they do this type of lifestyle. And that's true even if you're working for a corporation that allows you to travel around and work from wherever. The place that you're at will determine your cost of living to a certain degree, but so will the type of life that you want to live,
Mhm.
so will travel expenses that pop up or other expenses that emerge because you don't have the benefits of living in one place for a very long period of time. I didn't have insurance for the longest time except for like cataclysmic disaster insurance
Yeah.
that I had just in case. And so certain things were more difficult and expensive for me that wouldn't have been difficult and expensive for people who live in one place.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of that type of thing as well, just infrastructural issues that uh, are not always inferior. In some cases, you have more options and you have cheaper options than other people, but they're very different than other people. And then on top of that, I would add as a third thing, typically when you're building this type of lifestyle, especially if you're not just copying somebody else's, that you see somebody on Instagram and say, okay, I'm going to do that, and then you do
Mhm.
exactly that. Instead, you build your own thing, which is what I would recommend. None of the defaults apply to you. And so almost always that means there's not an instruction manual or a metaphorical instruction manual the way there is for so many other ways of living.
Yeah.
And consequently, you have to be comfortable making a lot of mistakes. And ideally, when you come out the other end, you try to write up a quick instruction manual for other people to follow if they have X, Y, and Z that is true the same way that you did. But
Mhm.
even without that, even if you're not trying to leave signs for other people following a similar path behind you, you got to carve the path. And that is something that some people find to be very fulfilling. To me, it's something that's difficult and uncomfortable at times, but it's also something that I find to be very fulfilling and
Mhm.
interesting and
Yeah.
growth inducing. But a lot of people do not find that to be the case. And so there's a certain amount of suffering, even that can come
Mhm.
from this type of lifestyle, because there's going to be very few people who can tell you exactly what to do to get the outcomes that you want.
Yeah. It might be true that the motivations for why you're doing it in the first place is probably the biggest question you need to ask yourself. But as I hear you list off those three major downsides, for me, the only one that really matters, I think, is the relationships aspect of it. Because you talk about expenses and you talk about, um, not having not having a guidebook, so you'd be making mistakes, and perhaps you'd be disappointed with decisions you make and all this sort of stuff. That is also applicable to whatever regular life you're going to have. I think with the nomadic digital nomadic life, the relationships one is massive there. And yeah, probably romantic relationships is the biggest one there, and also relationship with your own family. Being away for such a long time does inherently change you from the rooted context that you come from. So I wonder if you've had the same experiences as me. But when I left Australia and effectively didn't come back for 4 or 5 years, and then when I came back, I'd changed so much, but everything was exactly the same. Okay, for all the amazing, all the sentimental reasons, the great sentimental reasons, they were the same, but then also disappointingly, things were the same. I wonder if you've had a
Mm.
similar experience, because I asked that question with the context of saying that relationships is probably the biggest downside to the digital nomadic.
It can be tricky. I remember actually having several conversations about this when I would return to visit my family, which is something that I try to do on a regular basis. Just I've got three amazing siblings, and I've got two great parents, and I've got some great extended family too. Well, I won the family lottery, and so I try to make sure that I check in on people and come see what they've been up to. But the way that I think about it is that when you do change contexts, and that can be geographic context, it can be professional context, it can be anything that changes your point of view or allows you to change, you have more opportunities typically to both iterate like small changes, but also then have like revolutionary changes where something changes everything about you.
Hmm.
And you do it then in this separate space.
Yeah.
So you've got all these variables that not just allow you, but incentivize you to a certain degree to make these changes a lot faster and a lot more dramatically than is typical. And then you go to a place where most of the changes are going to be more ponderous and iterative. That it is a conflict, and it's tricky because socially, and this is not people being mean or horrible or trying to hold anybody back, but socially, we tend to develop expectations about certain norms about everybody. And that's people that we care about, people that we barely know. We get somewhat uncomfortable when people behave in ways that don't align with our mental idea of who they are as an archetype.
Hmm.
And so conflicts can emerge thoughtlessly, usually not maliciously, when somebody seems to change in a way
Hmm.
that seems disingenuous. And
Yeah,
so when
yeah.
you go out and travel and have a bunch of changes, you go to university or you go to another country, or you just have a different experience. Even in your hometown, you have something that changes you. If you suddenly like bananas and you never liked bananas before, you suddenly like a new type of music, you never liked it before, you suddenly have decided you're going to be an artist, you've decided that you're going to be a banker. If it conflicts with somebody else's view of who you are, to them that seems like disingenuity, but it also is uncomfortable. There's a cognitive dissonance there that is actually psychologically stressful for the person on the other end. So it's the type of thing that I totally agree. It sucks and is uncomfortable and necessitates, in my mind, a certain number of very upfront conversations. Here's an experience I had. Here's what I think now. Here's who I am now. I would appreciate if you would not hold me to this standard of the person who doesn't eat anything. I was a very picky eater when I was a kid. Now I
Mm,
eat anything, literally. I'll try anything. I would appreciate it if you would change your perception of who I am, because this is who I am now. I've been like this for
mm.
years. You
Yeah,
just don't know that because we haven't been in the right circumstances for
yeah.
that. So that's difficult and it's uncomfortable, but it's also, in my mind, understandable, because without thinking about it, we actually do the same thing as anybody else. Even if we
Mhm.
travel around, we do hold people to these same standards for the same reasons.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. I really do think exactly the same as you do. So we don't have to go on about that more, but I want to see, what do you think about the trends? Bit of a, I don't know, throwaway word to use, but if you look at when you started doing this, purposefully going to a city in a country you didn't know, probably spoke a language you didn't speak, and lived for 4 months, say, and then iterated that across a lot of different countries. What sort of changes have you seen from this style of living in the last 10, 15 years? Because I
Oh man,
imagine, I mean, actually, I don't need to prime you at all. You know exactly what I'm talking about. So, yeah.
I want to make sure I say this right because I don't want to be, I want to be productively uh, explanatory, not unnecessarily critical of somebody else's decision of how to do this sort of thing.
Mm,
Because the big change for me is that I started this and was developing in this before Instagram. And so for me, actually, like my early days, I was recalibrating all my storage space recently. So I'm redoing my cloud and my external hard drive and everything. And going through my old photos, they're all taken with a little point and shoot camera. Like I had a phone part of the
yeah.
time. One year I decided to go without a phone, but I had a little point and shoot camera most of the time. That changes things. Like I was
Mm,
posting a few photos here and there on newsletters and things, and every once in a while on like Facebook, which was still in its infancy,
mm.
but it wasn't the
The
way
value
that
of
it,
that photo is so much more.
oh my God. And again, it changes the way that people look at things, not necessarily in a way that makes it worse. It just changes it. It makes it different. The other thing that's emerged from that is the concept of influencers and such, and that is something that I think has taken on additional meaning and a lot of negative meaning. I don't think it has to be negative, but a lot of the implication of it these days is superficiality, and that does change what people are looking for too. You go to a restaurant because it has beautiful food. You go to a place because it's got that photo worthy background. To each their own. There's definitely a lot to be said about aesthetics and appreciating good aesthetics. And some of these photos are gorgeous.
Mm,
And I'm sure the adventure of getting there to get the photo or the video that you shoot might be the excuse to go there, which is totally legit. There's no wrong way to do any of this in my mind.
hmm.
But that's been the biggest change. that I've seen, and it's something that is not interesting to me just because what I'm doing it for is something else. I'll take a good photo if I see one. It can be very satisfying to do that sometimes, but it's not the end goal. And
Hmm.
it's not, it is definitely doing similar things for wildly different outcomes. And that's okay.
Yeah.
It's just different. And it changes. The incentives are also different as a consequence of that because
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
how people make money and such, which is another thing that is not my thing. But for somebody for whom it is their thing, I think that's totally okay.
Influences aside, though, because I think it's pretty transparent to see what the uh, you say disingenuous. I don't want to reuse the word, but people can sort of transparently see how disingenuous and influences uh, um, portrayal of their life is. I think most people can see through that and be like, I don't fully believe it, and therefore I don't really inherently want it that much. Can you comment more on, say, the effect that so many digital nomads being out there has had on, say, destinations, and maybe even how it affects wider, um, more casual traveling, right?
Yeah. One example that comes to mind, I've lived in Iceland a couple of times in Reykjavik, and I just remember the first time that I went to Reykjavik, the downtown was mostly locals.
What year?
This would have been 2000 and maybe late 2010, I think.
Oh wow, because their
It,
boom was like 2015, 16, right?
yeah, I mean, well, they had the initial one after the market crash in 2008, 2009. So they basically their currency collapsed, and then people
Okay.
started to think because you could suddenly go there and afford things. Um, at that point, I think there was one hostel.
Okay.
I couldn't even get a spot at the one hostel, so I had to like rent a room in somebody's house. But like it was that state of affairs where they had like a potential tourism economy, and I
Mm.
think there was one little shop downtown next to the Penis Museum where you could go and get like a map and you could like rent a car to take you out and the Golden Circle and everything. The last time I was there, which was probably what 2016 maybe, something like that. There's no locals downtown. I mean, sometimes kind of sort of they work there, but like you could previously go from downtown, which is where I was living a couple of the times I was there. You could get like a light bulb. There was a store that had light bulbs.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of those stores have been replaced by places that sell you plastic Viking helmets and stuffed puffins.
Mhm.
And again, this is another thing that's not inherently bad, not inherently good. More tourism means that they don't have to sell off all their land for mineral harvesting, which is, I
Mhm.
know it's a common problem in New Zealand and a bunch of other places as well. Like, do we allow more crazy tourists in, or and refocus parts of the economy to that, or do we allow people to buy up all of our mineral wealth and destroy our ecology? So, not good, not bad. It changes things.
Mhm.
For me, it's a lot less interesting because that is that theme park version of a travel experience that you have accidentally, but it's formalized in such a way that everybody gets kind of a cookie cutter version of that. And that makes it a lot easier and a lot more accessible to more people, which I think is wonderful because you can have a really legitimate context changing experience, even with like a guided tour somewhere. You show up and you never meet somebody with whom you have a relationship that's not predicated on money. That can
Mhm.
still be okay.
Mm.
But a lot more places are going in that direction. And I know now there's a counter movement against it. I think like Amsterdam, I feel like I read recently is trying to do a push to get a bunch of the drunken tourists out of the downtown so
Yeah.
that locals can enjoy it again. But I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with that clash because I think there is value on both sides of that coin. It's just figuring out the right balance so that you don't destroy the for either person.
Yeah. It is a tough situation to figure out, obviously, because especially you look at Iceland, sure, but they're still a northern European economy. They have low corruption within their systems. You feel like they can more or less develop economic streams of income outside of tourism. Take a look at Indonesia, for example. Bali. Take a look at Thailand. Chiang Mai.
Mm.
Take a look at Mexico, Tulum. These places don't necessarily have other options, and therefore you can totally understand why the local economy would totally change. But then
Yep.
obviously, and it's transparent to anyone who thinks about it for a minute, but why are you really going there then? Because, for example, if I wanted to go to Bali and live for a few months, I would have access to brilliant food, brilliant beaches, and a brilliant lifestyle. You walk around in thongs all day. Like, that's bloody magnificent. And if you want to do that, then that's cool. Like, go there and do that. I think what isn't spoken about enough in this type of context, because I see it happening all the time online. I used to work for a software company that sells to tour operators.
Mm.
And so it was always spoken about, these guys are the problem. They're the businesses that start serving the tourisms and changing the local demographics of an area. But something that's not spoken about enough is how essentially limitless the destinations are that you can go to. You don't have to go to Bali. Indonesia is a chain of hundreds of islands. If you're dead set and you've got the adventurous backbone in you, like, you'll find a place where no other white people are, and you're going to have a really hard time communicating. And like, that's one of the brilliant moments of travel, when you truly find yourself lost and you can't communicate and you don't know what's going to happen. Like that, they're the moments, at least for me, that I seek out and remember the most. But
Mm-hmm.
if I ask you off the top of your head, what are some destinations that you see could be great for setting up for a couple of months that don't necessarily have a lot of people doing it at the moment?
One actually comes to mind right away. Um, so there's a place in the Philippines called Mayuyao, and it's in the Ifugao region. And so basically, the biggest island, and it's like in the not beach part. It's like in the mountains, and I did not know what I was getting myself into when I went to Airbnb, and I zoomed out to find the
Yeah.
sparsest populated part, uh, to basically contrast with the other place I was intending to stay in the Philippines, Boracay, which is just like a hardcore beach tourist or destination. And I wanted to see that two sides of the coin. And it's a place full of just absolutely lovely people in the middle of nowhere. It's just rice terraces as far as the eye can see. There's
Amazing.
no grocery stores or banks. There's no commerce. It's a village,
Yep.
and they've got like this central building. It's like a gathering building that they're trying to turn into a hostel.
Hmm.
And I think I was the first person that they'd had there in ages, just the first like visitor in
Yeah.
ages. And so as a consequence, they're not set up for it. And so I basically, to get food, I paid a neighbor to basically make me a portion of all the meals that they made. And I would spend my day writing, and then I'd go wander around, and all the kids would look at me like I was like some kind
Amazing.
of crazy
Yeah.
ghost. And I would look at them like, what are you doing? You're just wandering around the rice terraces all day. That's
Yeah.
amazing. Um, it was incredible. And places like that I really enjoy. And I think especially if part of the tricky part right now is just getting there. Like, somebody from there had to come fetch me
Oh
in a
yeah.
nearby town. Well, nearby, like I think it was like 4.5 hours away,
Yeah.
in a town, and then they had to take like the town's van to take me through this mountain area. And one of the directions, it was either the way there or the way back, there was a mudslide, so we were stopped for hours while another village came in and had to dig out the road. But those sorts of things to me are just
Yeah.
utterly fascinating. And the people you
Yeah.
meet, the relationship dynamic is so different because they're not accustomed to dealing with tourists all day,
Hmm.
basically, or anybody necessarily who they didn't grow up with. And as a consequence, it tends to be very memorable for very different reasons than a
Yeah.
place like Calcutta, for instance.
That's such a great story, and like, that's also what you're looking for. I mean, sometimes, maybe not all the time, but what you're really looking for when you want to get out there in some sort of adventure where you can, almost get lost. Just the fact that they're looking at you like they haven't seen a white guy in 6 months. I mean, that's a good sign,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
people aren't going to come up and try and hustle you, because, the concept of hustling these rich white guys doesn't even exist. And I wonder, maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, this exact place, it could turn into Bali. And you know what? It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if it did, because what that creates for the local populace is more important than us being able to, escape our own cities, right?
Pros and cons. Yeah,
And
exactly.
and then
People looking for contrast, we can find
oh,
contrast,
you can find
you
countries.
know.
Yeah, because I was just thinking while you were saying that, other destinations like you can go to Sicily and get really lost and find beautiful places, you know?
Right. Try driving around Missouri. That's where I'm at now. I
Yeah.
mean, there's so many. Yeah, it's something that I usually encourage people to do when they email me and say, "Where should I go first?" Like, go to a neighboring town. Just drive. Like, we don't even explore our own cities.
Mm,
Something that appeals to us about traveling to other places. One, in a lot of cases, it's being able to tell people that we're going to and telling people that we did.
mm,
But then two, it's like this idea that we are so far removed, nothing is familiar. Therefore, we can break out of all of our habits and all of our concerns. We can be a different person. You can do that anywhere. And being able to allow yourself to do that and to get into the habit of doing it means that you can then enjoy any place you go. Like any place I go now, this is why I travel around the US so often. There's a lot of familiar stuff here. I do not feel like a fish out of water going to some place in Oklahoma or to New Orleans or to California the way that I do in some place in Southeast Asia. But you can still notice the differences and acknowledge the historical changes and the
mhm,
cultural influence in the area and the differences in food. And you can basically say, I'm not in that place I usually am. Nobody here knows me. I can be
mhm.
anybody that I want to be. I can try on new versions of myself so that I can wig out everybody when I go back home, the way that you do when you travel to other places. Uh, that to me is like a really fundamental skill if you want to travel on a regular basis. One, because it's cheaper typically to just travel to a nearby town, but two, you do see things in relatively comparably
Mm,
less contrasty places. You notice more minute, specific differences than you do when you go to a place where nobody speaks the same language or eats the same food.
mm.
You're forced to. And to me, that's a very valuable thing that then applies when you go to more dramatically different places. But it's also something that allows you to appreciate uh, travel as a lifestyle as opposed to a vacation.
Yeah, that's actually a really good insight you just had, which rings true with me. Like there are subtle, exact similarities between, say, if you go to your neighboring town where no one knows you, or if you go to this random village in the Philippines, and the sort of way you're approached as like an outsider, an unknown. That's yeah, that's really interesting. So, as a bridge to sort of transition into another big sort of theme of things you write about, and it might seem like a bit of a lazy question, but nonetheless, it is intended to be open-minded. But do you think much about lifestyle design?
It depends on how you define it. Because I know that's a term is Tim Ferriss, right? I know there's like a pseudo-branded version of that that
Yeah,
means
Tim
very
Ferriss
specific
is
things.
definitely a proponent of it. I don't know who initially coined it or anything like that.
Okay. I mean, in
Um,
terms of basically just the deconstructed version of that, where you're thinking about how you set up your life and then trying to put things in your life that orient you toward where you'd like to be and that allow you to live today the way that you'd like to live. Yes,
mhm.
that is at the forefront of my mind anytime I make a decision about work, that I make a decision about relationships, that I make a decision about where I'm living, anything.
Because I wanted to see what role sort of minimalism had in your thoughts about lifestyle design. Because I mean, you made a
Hmm.
big point out of the fact that when you sold the agency and started traveling, you did so you had everything you owned in a duffel bag, right? And that's
Yeah.
is
So it was a very practical decision. It wasn't something where I said, "Hey, I'm going to be a minimalist," and then got rid of my stuff. It wasn't a term that I knew actually,
mm,
except in the context of like art history and design. Um, so for me it was about getting rid of stuff that was standing in the way of me doing the stuff that I wanted to do. Every single one of these things that seemed like it might be useful at some point to me
mm,
suddenly felt like a burden that I had to literally carry around.
yeah.
So getting rid of that stuff was trying
Okay,
to.
so it was more of a practical decision. What I'm trying to get at here is for you to sort of talk a little bit about minimalism and how prominent a role it plays in your life and the way you think about things.
Sure, sure. Well, these days in particular, it's not something that I think about much. Not in the sense of what would a minimalist do right now, or
Right.
anything like
Okay.
that. Um, because ultimately, and this is something that is not always clear necessarily, like minimalism is a means to an end. It's not something where you say, I'm going to be a minimalist, and then you sit around and talk about minimalism all day and join all the minimalism clubs and stuff. Like you can, if you want to have that group of people who have similar ideas or are going through something similar. But ideally, minimalism gets you to some place, and it gets you to a place where you're focusing more of your time, energy, and resources on the most important things. And eventually, that becomes kind of a habit where you just don't introduce, or you typically, more so than before, don't introduce stuff that stands in your way. And you
Mm.
get very good at uh, unsheathing yourself from the things that do stand in your way. And so generally, when I'm orchestrating things, you could say, well, that's a minimalist practice, but I don't usually use that terminology except when I'm speaking about it to people to share the concept broadly.
Okay.
Ideologically, it's a part of my thinking process, but uh, am I thinking, should I introduce this new thing to my life? Well, then I'm going to have, like, I'm not usually going through a step-by-step formula for minimalism. I'm mostly thinking big picture. Does this help me get to where I'd like to be? Is this resource well spent on this thing, this product or activity, or could I better spend it on something else? That sort of thing.
I wanted to ask you a question based around my understand, well, not my understanding, a theory that I have around minimalism, because it is, very trendy, right? Especially maybe more so a few years ago, but I mean, it still is a very, I don't know, trendy. Trendy is a better way to put it. But basically, and I have a theory, and it's totally unsubstantiated, and it's not evidence based or anything like that. It's just kind of a thought I had. But I was wondering if maybe minimalism, and its popularity could be some sort of at the cultural level, a subconscious response to the sort of utilitarianism of everything. And it's not a political word, utilitarianism, but the fact that everything we have has a utility primarily, and then secondarily, maybe um, uh, an efficiency, how much did it cost, and then third, maybe they think about aesthetics. And so because um, especially us in the West, in Australia and in America, we might have had for for our experiences this idea of everything we have has a very specific utility, but it's not beautiful at all. That the fact that minimalism came around and said, "We'll get rid of all this shit because you actually can do all these things without that utility," because you then remove whatever ugliness it is from your life. And so does that resonate with you at all, that idea, or am I sort of overthinking it? Because that could definitely be the case.
Honestly, I think you could frame it that way. I think you could frame it in a lot of different ways. You could look at the economics of it. I think branding has a lot to do with it. You could look at the actual philosophies. You could look at it as kind of a faith-based movement, almost to a certain degree. You could look at it as a counter movement against consumerism. I think all of these perspectives are probably right, and I think they're more right than others, for some people more than others. I do think that, well, I know just based on art history, and based on
Hmm.
history, and based on economics and stuff, we do tend to see ebbs and flows with what we might call minimalism and what we might call maximalism, and they take different shapes and happen in different cultures at different times.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense that in an era of particular and increasingly widespread consumption, we would then see a pushback against that. I also think it makes perfect sense that in a lot of cases, we would see that very concept that's meant to be a pushback also appropriated by consumption and to be an excuse to buy more stuff of a particular aesthetic or something else like that.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, my succinct response would be, yeah.
what, what do you mean, like faith based? You said,
Yeah, I just having had the opportunity to speak to a lot of people
mm,
who talk about this sort of thing and live different permutations of this sort of thing and who find it appealing. There is a cleansing ritual or purification ritual aspect
mm,
to it that I think a lot of people find appealing. And that purification or cleansing sort of thing you find in a lot of religions. It's the idea of cleansing oneself to make oneself more pure and a better version of whatever it is that you want to be.
Mm.
And I say that in a non-judgmental way. That's like, it is just something that all of us do to a certain degree, using different words for the different concepts. But the ritualization of certain aspects of minimalism is definitely a thing. And in that shape, I think it's more, maybe faith is the wrong term. It's like a belief system, as opposed to some other decision based around consumerism or economics or whatever else.
Taiwan is front and center of my mind. And so I'm pretty much needling it into every conversation I have if possible. I'm not familiar with whether you have lived there for any extended period of time or not. I assume you've visited there. Maybe you haven't.
I have not actually,
Okay.
though I want to.
Do you have any thoughts off the top of your head about it? I mean, it's not
I'm
worth much
worried
for
about
me.
it right now. I know, just from my projects that I do, I know quite a bit about what's happening there geopolitically right now, and I worry about them. One, because they are like the center of the semiconductor industry in the world right now. They are like the semiconductor manufacturer of the world right now, and the fact that they are in such awkward, frictionful straits at the moment, we could say, with their neighbor China. That is unfortunate, and I do worry, especially with all the other swirling geopolitical entanglements happening in the world right now, that something could happen in the relatively near future, and that something could spiral. So I worry about the people there. I worry what that could then spiral into, because to me, it's kind of a trigger point for a lot of other things potentially.
I think they could very well be the defining political moment of my generation. You know, like for our parents' generations, it was maybe the fall of the Berlin Wall or something like this. I think,
Mm.
in the next 50, 60 years, whether it's either through Chinese aggression or through US aggression in support of Taiwan, whatever ends up happening there, I think it will be the sort of catalyst of it. You said because of your projects. So what sort of projects do you have familiarity with it? What's that about?
For Let's Know Things, which is my main podcast
Yeah.
that I've been running for like 4.5 years at this point, I think.
Yeah.
It's news analysis, and so essentially I take something happening in the news and then extrapolate on it and try to show how that news item fits into historical context, but also broader than geopolitical, economic, etc. context.
Yeah.
And so Taiwan comes up from time to time, but so does just China in general and technology in general. And there's a lot of tendrils going out from that central issue into other issues right now.
I know I said I'd only ask you one more, but I just want to expand on that for 1 second. When you produce these sort of podcasts, do you sort of write down a script that's very accurate that you're going to read off? And where do you get your research from? Is it all done yourself and it's just within whatever your purview is? You don't outsource any sort of research or anything like this?
Yeah, I don't outsource anything. I do all the research, the writing, the recording, the producing,
Cool.
all of it. It's something I like, the creative control of keeping it all in house. It also makes it easier to do it from wherever.
Nice. That's really cool. I just last week launched a podcast called the Geopolitics and Power Podcast.
Oh, nice.
And it sounds like that exact process that you just outlaid is the same as what I'm doing.
Yeah, and in terms of research, it's basically just finding credible sources for all sorts of things. It depends on what the subject of the day or the subject of the week, as it's a weekly podcast, happens to be. But in a lot of cases, it's finding domain experts, looking at links and everything that I read to find the original sources to further assess credibility, and then writing something up, generally sticking with it unless I find a better way to phrase it while I'm recording.
Yep. All right, Colin, here we go. This is kind of like a baseline question I've asked everyone, but if you could witness a conversation between any two people of history, dead or alive, doesn't matter, does a nice chant come to mind?
Oh my God. A conversation between any two people in history.
Literally just for your benefit.
Yeah. I feel like there'd be a lot of interesting ones. And a lot of, my mind immediately goes to different hotspot things, but I wonder if there would be some less obvious ones, something not like war related or conquest
Yeah, right.
related. That unfortunately, a lot of the
Something
history is
without
about that,
Churchill.
isn't it? Yeah, exactly. Something non-Churchillian. I know there was a couple cloak and dagger conversations during World War II to try to get the US involved initially. That might have been interesting. Would it be translated? Because a lot of the probably most interesting conversations would be
Mm.
like
What happened between languages?
proto-human beings meeting up with the Denisovans, the Denisovans, or the Neanderthals, or something like that.
Okay.
That would be remarkable. But I don't think the Neanderthals could even speak. I think they like sang or something.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it would be, would I have somebody there to translate all the gestures and throat warbling, or would it be something where
Yeah,
I'd
let's
have to
assume they
just
can
see it happen?
translate. It's an interesting
Okay,
place
you
to
know
go
what?
to. Maybe I think maybe I mean if just my cynical mind, but I don't know if they would have had a necessarily interesting conversation. I think it might have just been more aggression, right?
Well, it might have been interesting in the sense of seeing what two tribes who thought they were the only hominids at the time thought when they
Yeah,
first
true.
encountered each other. I mean, probably it would have been something related to sex or commerce,
Yeah, yeah,
if not that violence.
yeah.
One of those three things. But knowing which one, I think that would be interesting.
Nice, cool. Well, look, I'm sorry I keep dragging it on, but I feel like you have maybe I haven't done a very good job here to just really highlight just how almost erudite your understanding and interests are. I think in you answering that last question, it sort of brought it a little bit higher to mind. So maybe and I don't know if you've seen, but usually on this podcast, I'm more talking about sort of like investing, businesses, geopolitics, this sort of stuff. But because I myself am a digital nomad, I do really enjoy this vlog. And like I was saying, I've been following Exile Lifestyle for so long, and that's kind of like how I knew you. That was my relationship with you. You're one of the first people on the list that I reached out to. But nonetheless, too much preamble. This I think is an interesting one. If you could go long on a country, right? So over the next 50, 60 years, who are you most bullish on?
Canada.
Oh, yeah? Okay. Do you want to
Yeah,
explain why?
by far. Well, there's a lot of reasons. I think culturally, uh, this is something that's very subjective. Culturally, I think they have a lot going for them. It's very pleasant. They have a lot of flaws, but it's very pleasant overall. They have many of the same advantages that Russia has in terms of resources that are freshly becoming accessible because of climate change, and new trade routes going over the top of the planet that are opening up because the ice is not reforming in the same way that it was before. And so I think they're going to have a huge advantage in terms of essentially owning what is going to be half of what amounts to like the Pacific Ocean coastline in 20, 30 years.
Mm,
And I think they're in a very interesting position because the contrast, or the main contrast, because there's other countries obviously lining the Arctic Circle,
yeah.
the main contrast is Russia. And Russia has a lot of advantages coming into this as well. But I feel like because of what Canada represents in terms of the type of government, in
Sure.
terms of what they represent in terms of their
Western support.
alliances, their general good reputation throughout the world, the general, not universal, general positive direction of a lot of their policies and getting ahead of certain trends that Russia is not because they're more of a petro state. I think they have a lot of advantages coming into the next several decades, and
And
whether
that's
they use
purely
them or not, who's
and
to
that's
say?
purely
But
based on the Arctic becoming a
uh,
more accessible
partially,
area.
partially the Arctic, partially basically arable land, the bands of arable land shifting upward and moving up toward Canada, so that
Hmm.
basically more of their land they can use for agriculture, more of their land they can actually tap into the resources if they choose to. More of it will be livable more of the year.
Hmm.
And more passages then opening up in terms of one, building things like airports and railway stations, but also then building docks and things. Yeah, a lot of the things that have determined good fortune in the 20th and early 21st century, I think by the mid 21st century, Canada potentially will have those in
Hmm.
spades.
And add one more to their list. Canada is one of the greatest countries in the world at attracting the best talent from developing nations. So
Mm.
in the last 20,
Yeah, I guess
30,
they are, aren't they?
yeah, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, a lot of their best labor. So they've kind of brought them over from, say, Sri Lanka, India, Vietnam, whatever. But then they've kind of upskilled themselves in Canada through the education system and then gone down to America and worked with the big tech firms or whatever.
Mm.
So it hasn't been a perfect route because obviously one of the, taking in a lot of migration is extremely costly, and you need that investment in these people to eventually return fruits. And that only happens if they work for countries that provide tax income dollars, Canadian tax income dollars. But because America might be, it's sweeping statement, but I don't know, just less attractive on the international stage to live at the moment. And if what you're saying is true, which also, I think I agree with you, that they would become a more powerful economy within their own right, it could make more sense that people would stay there, more opportunities for them to stay there. And so they also just have access to amazing and intellectual capital. Even the Canadians themselves through a great education system, but also by attracting some of the best from developing countries around the world.
That's a very good point.
The book Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall, he has a whole chapter on the end on the Arctic. It's very good.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think you'd really like it. Yeah, like Russia has actually dropped a titanium flag at the North Pole. And I think it's true that Canada has, like you said, this enormous coastline, but I think Russia is spending significantly more money now on setting up the infrastructure to then sort of take the Arctic.
They seem to me a bit more, well, it could go anyway, obviously. I have no idea what's actually going to happen. To me, the reason that I would bet on Canada over Russia is because the inherent fragilities in certain aspects of the Russian economy and the Russian government. The flaws in rule of law is a big one, because you can, for a while, maintain a very effective authoritarian system, but it becomes more difficult when the rest of the world is not also authoritarian. And you can maintain for a very long time for lack of a better term, kind of a mafia state based off of petrochemicals. But when the rest of the world is shifting away from petrochemicals, and you have not shown any desire to invest as fully in the renewable technologies that the rest of the world is shifting to, if Russia was today doing what China is doing and trying to own like solar panels or something like that and become the source of the best solar panels, that would be one thing, because then they'd be taking today's riches and turn it into something else. Again, it's hard to say. It's largely
pure speculation,
speculation, but I do feel like there's more vulnerability,
widely entertaining speculation
right now.
Yeah,
it could go any direction though. Like there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in Russia right now too.
But I think what you say about Russia is totally correct. I mean, they have one of the most rapid declining birth rates in Europe. They have a significantly older population than young. They're extremely distributed, and they're an extractive economy, and extractive economies are completely unsustainable when they're measured against an inclusive economy like Canada is. But yeah, look, Colin, maybe that's a good place to leave it. I've taken 20 more minutes of your time than you allowed. I really, really, really do appreciate that, mate.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It was worth it. Well, great talking to you.
Amazing, mate. Really appreciate it. Take it easy. Have a good day.
My pleasure. You too.
See you later.
See ya.